All right, let's just dive right in. The central claim of Christianity, it isn't just that Jesus was some great moral teacher. Nope. It's something way, way more audacious. A claim that literally turned the ancient world on its head, that a carpenter from a small town in Nazareth was and is God in human form.
So, where do you even start with a claim that huge? Well, the sources we're looking at suggest the proof isn't in some lofty philosophical debate. Instead, it's all about digging into the specific things Jesus said and did. But, and this is key, seeing them through the eyes of the people he was actually talking to.
And believe me, that context is everything. You have to understand, for a first-century Jew, the belief in one singular, indivisible God, Yahweh, wasn't just an idea. It was the bedrock of their entire reality. So you can imagine every single thing Jesus said or did was immediately measured against this one non-negotiable belief.
Okay, so with that background set, let's get into the first part of our explainer, the core Christian claim. We're going to look at how the biblical sources build their case for divinity. The whole case really boils down to two main things. First, what Jesus actually said about himself, and second, what he did, the kinds of actions that seem to belong only to God. So get this. Jesus wasn't just saying, hey, I've got a message from God. He was claiming to have the rights of God. Things like forgiving sins, using God's own name, saying he was equal to the Father. I mean, in that culture, these weren't just bold statements. They were earth-shattering, absolutely shocking. This right here is a perfect example. When Jesus says, I am, he's not just talking about his existence. He's using the Greek phrase ego eimi, which is the exact same phrase used in the Greek Old Testament when God reveals his personal name to Moses at the burning bush. And the people listening? Oh, they got it, instantly. Their reaction wasn't to ask for clarification, it was to pick up rocks to stone him for blasphemy. And we see the same dynamic play out here. He says, I and the Father are one, and the crowd immediately accuses him of making himself equal with God. Once again, they go to kill him. So whether you believe him or not, it's undeniable that the people who heard him speak understood exactly what he was claiming: divinity. And it wasn't just his words, right? His actions spoke just as loudly. The Old Testament is crystal clear that only Yahweh can command the sea and the wind. So when Jesus stands up in a boat and tells a raging storm to stop, and it does, he's not just performing some magic trick. He's doing something that everyone around him believed only God himself had the power to do. Okay, but to be fair, it's not all that simple. To get the full picture, we have to look at the other side. There are definitely verses in the Bible that people point to, verses that seem to challenge this idea of divinity, and suggest that Jesus is somehow lesser than God, or maybe even created by him. So, what's the comeback? How does Christian theology handle these apparent contradictions? Well, over time, it developed very specific ways of reading these verses to create a coherent picture that, they argue, makes sense of all the evidence. Let's break down a couple of the most common examples. You've got the verse where Jesus says, the Father is greater than I. The theological response is, well, yeah, he's speaking from the perspective of his human nature in his role on earth. It's about his mission, not his fundamental being. Then there's the phrase, firstborn of all creation. It sounds like he was created first, right? But the rebuttal is that in that culture, firstborn was a title. It meant the one with all the rights, the heir, the one in charge, not the first one off the assembly line. It's a classic case of context being king. So you've got this complex set of beliefs floating around. How did it all get hammered out into official, capital D, doctrine? Well, it wasn't overnight. It was a process that unfolded over centuries as the early church wrestled with exactly who Jesus was. And this is really important because it shows this wasn't some idea that got tacked on centuries later. This quote is from around 110 AD. That's just one generation after the apostles. It's pretty clear evidence that from very, very early on, Christians were referring to Jesus as their God. This early belief was then clarified and defended in these massive church councils. In 325 at Nicaea, they drew a line in the sand saying Jesus was consubstantial with the Father. Then later, in 451 at Chalcedon, they defined his two natures, fully divine and fully human. You can think of these councils not as inventing new ideas, but as putting a protective fence around what the church believed it had received from the very beginning. So what on earth does consubstantial mean?
It's a huge word, but the idea is actually pretty simple. It comes from the Greek homoousios, which means of the same substance. It's saying that whatever that essential godness is that makes God God, Jesus has it too. Not a lesser version, not a similar version, but the exact same stuff. They are equally God.
And that leads us to this next big idea, the hypostatic union. This is the official term for how Jesus can be both 100% God and 100% man at the same time. The doctrine says he is one single person who has two complete natures, a divine one and a human one, and that these two are united forever without being jumbled up or confused.
Okay, so fancy Greek words, ancient councils. Why does any of this actually matter? Well, for Christian theology, it's the whole ballgame when it comes to salvation. The logic goes like this. Human sin created an infinite offense against an infinite God. Therefore, only a sacrifice of infinite value could possibly pay that debt. A mere human or even an angel wouldn't cut it. It had to be God himself. You know, if you had to boil this entire, massive idea down to a single sentence, this verse from the Gospel of John is probably where you'd land. It's just so packed. It says, Jesus existed before creation, that he was distinct from the Father, and yet that he was God. All there in the opening line. So we've covered a lot of ground. We've looked at the claims, the actions, the counter-arguments, and the history. So we want to leave you with this final thought. Of everything we've talked about, what's the one piece of evidence, either for his divinity or against it, that really sticks with you? What's the one thing you'll still be mulling over after this explainer ends?